clock has started. Yes, sir. Reading it loud and clear.
Roger, roll, Discovery.
Discovery, roger, there and
Well, thank you, Andrew, and welcome to the October 31 Halloween edition of Space News. This is Peter Aylward, and I have Michael Abdullah and Angelo De Grazia with me from the Space Association. Good evening, gentlemen.
G'day, Peter.
G'day, Peter, Mike, and everybody.
Hello, world. So it's straight over to you, Angelo.
Okay, let's start off with USA space policy. We'll talk about the Space Force tonight. The White House continued to work on the next space policy directive dealing with the next steps for establishing a Space Force. That policy will become Space Policy Directive 4, will direct the Defence Department to submit a legislative proposal to the White House Office of Management and Budget by December the 1st, recommending that a Space Force be formed as a separate branch of the armed forces. The Defence Department would also include the Space Force in its fiscal year 2020 budget request. That policy would require the Space Force to be a lean organisation that will minimise duplication of effort and eliminate bureaucratic inefficiencies. Complementing this effort, the National Space Council met last week in Washington to discuss military space issues and approve a set of recommended actions regarding the creation of a Space Force. The Council signed off on 6 proposed actions ranging from establishment of a US Space Command to include the Space Force in the Pentagon's fiscal year 2020 budget request. Those recommendations were expected, but Vice President Mike Pence used the meeting to emphasise why he considered creating a space military branch for space so important. President Trump, Pence said, is determined to make the new military branch a reality. He asks me about the Space Force every week. Wow.
Oh, God.
Vice President Pence also used an appearance earlier the same day to continue to make the case for a Space Force. Speaking at a Washington Post event, Pence said he and Trump believed there was enough bipartisan support for the Space Force to get Congress to authorise its creation next year, regardless of the outcome of the November 6 midterm elections. Pence declined to endorse a cost estimate for the Space Force released by Air Force Secretary Heather Wilson last month that was criticised for its expense, but added that he would advise members of Congress, what price freedom? What is the price you place on the security of the United States? Big words, huh? Moving on. Meanwhile, the chairman of the House Armed Services Committee has asked the Pentagon for more details on how it would establish a Space Force or similar organisation. Representative Mac Thornberry, Republican, Texas, has asked Deputy Defence Secretary Patrick Shanahan and Vice Chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff General Paul Salva in a letter earlier this month to provide more details on its plans by November 16. Thornberry said his committee is looking at 4 options, which include a separate Space Force as well as Space Corps within the Air Force, an alternative modelled after Specials Operations Command. Still a lot of controversy with this one. We'll see how this pans out.
Actually, do you notice the dates? It looks like it's all going to sort of converge around the time of the next US presidential election, 2020.
It should be pretty interesting. All right, Peter, to you.
All right, still on US news, NASA Administrator Jim Bridenstine said that sanctions against his Russian counterpart, Dmitry Rogozin, will be temporarily lifted to allow him to visit the United States. Bridenstine told Russian media that a workaround to existing sanctions would allow Rogozin to come to the United States, but that no date has been set for the visit. Rogozin was banned from visiting the United States for his actions as Deputy Prime Minister of Russia when it annexed Crimea in 2014. Well, there you go. Mike.
Okay, let's look at NASA Lunar and Planetary. The Hubble Space Telescope could resume normal operations in the near future after engineers fixed a faulty gyroscope. The telescope has been in safe mode since October 5th, when the third of its 6 gyroscopes failed and another was unusable because it reported incorrect rotation rates. NASA said last week that troubleshooting appeared to resolve the problem, with the bulky gyro now reporting normal rates. Additional engineering tests were performed to confirm that the gyro was working properly before putting the telescope back into service. NASA also said that the Chandra X-ray Observatory, which suffered an unrelated gyro failure this month, should also resume operations after some final tests. Meanwhile, NASA expects to wrap up efforts to re-establish contact with the Mars Opportunity rover in the next couple of weeks, but will continue passively listening for any signals for months to come. A NASA official said last week the active listening phase that started more than a month ago, where NASA transmits commands to the rover and listens for any replies, will conclude soon as the agency shifts its attention to planning for the landing of the InSight spacecraft. Opportunity has not communicated with Earth since early June, when a massive dust storm blocked the sun and deprived the spacecraft of solar power. Meanwhile, scientists are monitoring an unusual cloud visible in the Martian atmosphere. The plume-like cloud was first seen by ESA's Mars Express spacecraft more than a month ago near the planet's equator. The cloud has persisted in the same location near the volcano Asia Mons, although scientists said the cloud is not linked to any volcanic activity. Instead, they believe the cloud is created by air flowing around the volcano. Angelo.
Okay, on to the continuing drama in Russia. Roscosmos announced last Saturday that the investigation into the Soyuz launch accident this month will be completed by the end of the month. In a statement, Roscosmos said a state commission had completed a preliminary report into the failure but did not disclose its findings. The final report and recommendations to prevent a similar accident happening again will be completed this week. Speculation on the failure has centred on a problem with the separation of one of four side boosters 2 minutes after liftoff, with one Russian report claiming that the booster was improperly installed, damaging a mounting lug. Roscosmos said once it receives that report, it will announce plans for the launching of the next crew on the Soyuz MS-11 spacecraft, as well as scheduling a spacewalk at the station to inspect a hole previously found in the MS-9 Soyuz spacecraft, which is currently docked at the space station. Some Russian media reports have stated that the Soyuz MS-11 spacecraft could launch as early as December the 3rd. Meanwhile, NASA Administrator Jim Bridenstine said last week that he believed crewed Soyuz launches would resume in December. Speaking at the National Space Council meeting, Bridenstine said investigators had a really good idea of what caused the Soyuz launch abort and were getting close to understanding it well enough to confidently launch again. He said he expected the next crewed Soyuz mission to take place in December after several launches of Soyuz rockets. Later in the week, speaking at a conference in Alabama, he said he was confident the Soyuz spacecraft would return to flight safely despite concerns about the quality control in the Russian human spaceflight program. Bridenstine acknowledged there are concerns about Russia's human spaceflight program in light of both that accident and the hole found in the Soyuz currently docked to the station, but he said he was very confident that the Soyuz crewed mission would resume in December and do so safely. Also, Russia launched a military satellite last week on the first flight of a Soyuz rocket since the aborted mission to the space station. The Soyuz 2.1B rocket lifted off from the Plesetsk Cosmodrome in northern Russia and placed a Lotus signals intelligence satellite into orbit. The launch was reportedly a success, although the Russian military provided few details about the mission. Russian officials had indicated that they planned at least 3 uncrewed Soyuz launches, including this military mission, as well as a Progress cargo vehicle and a European satellite launch from French Guiana, before the vehicle would be used to launch a crewed Soyuz spacecraft again. Still in Russia, and I guess justification for the Space Force, a missile spotted underneath a Russian fighter jet is thought to be a prototype of an anti-satellite ASAT weapon. The missile was seen for the first time last month mounted underneath a MiG-31 jet, and analysts think it is a mock-up of an ASAT under development by the Russian military. That ASAT, designed to intercept satellites in low Earth orbit, could be ready to enter service in 2022. Michael.
Okay, let's look at China. A Chinese company is moving closer to its first orbital launch. OneSpace performed a test of the 4th stage engine of its OSM rocket last week, ahead of its first orbital launch of the vehicle, which the company expects to take place before the end of the year. Meanwhile, another Chinese startup, LandSpace, is planning its first orbital launch any day now, which, if successful, would make it the first private Chinese company to place a satellite into orbit. Let's look at Blue Origin. A cargo ship has arrived at a Florida port for modifications to support Blue Origin's New Glenn rocket. Stena Freighter, a 60,000-ton cargo ship, 180 metres long, arrived recently at the port in Pensacola, Florida, where it will undergo modifications for upwards of 2 years, according to an official with a company that is working on the project. The ship was purchased by Blue Origin and will be modified to serve as a landing ship for first stages of the New Glenn rocket that Blue Origin is currently developing.
Well, that's a much larger platform than SpaceX use. They've got those barges, haven't they?
That's correct.
This is a full-on cargo ship.
And also, this ship will actually be moving when the rockets land, so I'm not quite sure how that will work, but it'll be great to see.
Yeah, and the New Glenn is actually substantially bigger than the Falcon 9. So it's a really big ship, 60,000 tonnes worth.
Well, we look forward to the blooper video that will come out, no doubt. More US news. United Launch Alliance says the first launch of its Vulcan rocket has slipped to 2021. A company executive said at a conference last week that the first flight of the next generation rocket is now scheduled for April of 2021, after the company said as recently as last month that it was on track for a mid-2020 launch. ULA says that the timeline set in the Launch Service Agreement award it won from the US Air Force earlier this month, and additional requirements set by that program led to the revised schedule. Virgin Orbit are working away over there. Took another step closer to the first launch of its Launcher 1 rocket with fit tests. The company said on Wednesday of last week that its Cosmic Girl 747 carrier aircraft was being used for a series of tests to confirm that the rocket connects properly to the pylon on the aircraft's left wing. The fit test makes it likely that the company will soon be able to start captive carry tests of the aircraft with the rocket attached, a key test before the rocket's first launch. Back to you, Mike.
Northrop Grumman has named the next Cygnus spacecraft after legendary astronaut John Young. The spacecraft, scheduled for launch no earlier than mid-November on an Antares rocket from Virginia, will carry nearly 3.5 tons of cargo to the space station on a mission formally designated NG-10. The company announced last week it named the spacecraft SS John Young after the astronaut who flew 6 space missions, including the first Gemini flight and the first shuttle mission, and who walked on the moon on Apollo 16. Peter.
That's nice the way they do that, naming their spacecraft after significant space people. Alright, well finally this week, the City of Houston honoured legendary flight controller Gene Kranz at an event last week that also served as a fundraiser. At a luncheon, Houston Mayor Sylvester Turner presented Kranz with a proclamation that declared October 23 to be Gene Kranz Day in the city, honouring him for his career at NASA. The event also raised $300,000 to support renovations of the original Mission Operations Control Room at the Johnson Space Center, restoring it to its appearance at the time of the Apollo moon landings. That project has now raised $4.5 million of the estimated $5 million needed to complete the work in time for next July's Apollo 11 50th anniversary. Well, there you go. All right, well, that's it for Space News this week. Thank you, gentlemen, and it's back to you, Andrew.